What if the biggest lie in Silo is not the screen, not the cleaning, not even the outside world? What if the biggest lie is the reason the silos were built in the first place? Because for 2 seasons, the show has trained us to ask one question: is the outside safe? But season 3 seems to be pushing us toward a much bigger question: not what happened outside, but who prepared for it, who controlled the story afterward, and why an underground shelter built to save humanity looks more like a prison designed to study, control, and destroy it. And if you're obsessed with uncovering the secrets of the silo, the truth behind the founders, the outside world, and every little clue they hide in plain sight, make sure you like, subscribe, and drop your theory in the comments. I make these breakdowns all by myself, deep in the mechanical level with zero help from judicial. And most importantly, subscribe if you don't want to be sent out to clean. I'm joking, mostly. So before we get into the 3 big possibilities, here is the basic idea. There are really only a few ways to explain the silos. They are either doomsday bunkers built by powerful people who knew disaster was coming, or they're an ark, a backup plan for humanity in case civilization collapsed, or they are something far darker, an experiment where generations of people were trapped underground, watched, manipulated, and lied to for a purpose they never agreed to. And honestly, the scariest answer might be that all 3 theories are true at the same time. Let's start with the simplest explanation because it is also the one the residents themselves are basically taught to believe. The silos were built because the world ended. Something happened on the surface, possibly war, nuclear contamination, chemical fallout, a dirty bomb, or some kind of massive extinction-level disaster. People panicked, governments prepared, and the richest or most powerful people made sure they had somewhere to go when the world above them became unlivable. That version makes immediate sense. We have already seen enough from the world of Silo to know that the people underground did not just randomly end up there. The silos are enormous. They are engineered to last. They have power systems, farming systems, water, structure, law, labor, medical control, surveillance, social hierarchy, and a religious-like loyalty to the founders. That does not happen by accident. Somebody planned this for a very long time. And this is where the comparison to Fallout becomes useful. In Fallout, the vaults are sold as survival shelters, but they are also built by morally corrupt people with their own agendas. They are not just safe rooms, they are systems of control. That same feeling hangs over Silo. The idea of a bunker sounds comforting until you realize the bunker has cameras everywhere, fake history, forbidden relics, controlled reproduction, punishment rituals, and a deadly cleaning procedure that seems almost theatrical. That is the first red flag. If the silos were built only to save people, why build so much deception into the system? Because the cleaning alone tells us something is wrong. The residents are shown a dead world. Then, when someone is sent outside, they see something beautiful through the helmet display. They clean the sensor because they think everyone inside deserves to see the truth. Then they die. That is not just survival protocol, that is psychological engineering. The system knows exactly how humans will react when they believe they have discovered hope. It weaponizes that hope against them. And then you add the tape. The faulty tape was not a small defect, it was a design choice, or at least a maintained lie. If better sealing was possible, and certain people knew it was possible, then every cleaning was not just an execution, it was a staged execution, a ritual, a warning, a way to convince the entire silo that leaving equals death. And that is why the pure doomsday bunker theory starts to crack. Yes, the silos may have begun as shelters. Yes, there may have been a real disaster, but the systems inside them feel too cruel, too deliberate, and too manipulative to be explained as normal emergency planning. This is not just rich people hiding from the apocalypse. This is rich people, scientists, politicians, or some hidden authority building an entire civilization where truth itself is rationed. And that brings us to the second theory, the silos as an ark. This one sounds more out there at first, but emotionally it may be the most tragic. In this version, the silos were not only built to protect people from a disaster that already happened, they were built to preserve humanity in case something worse was coming. A kind of underground Noah's Ark, not necessarily one ark, but many. Each silo becomes a sealed version of humanity, protected from contamination, war, disease, social collapse, or whatever destroyed the surface world. That would explain why the silos were built to last for centuries. A normal bunker is temporary. You go inside, wait out the danger, then return when it's safe. But the silos don't feel temporary. Everything about them is designed to make people forget there was ever an alternative. Names disappear. History disappears. Objects from the past become forbidden relics. Curiosity becomes dangerous. Even wanting to know the truth becomes a crime. And if the goal was simply to wait for the world outside to recover, why erase the memory of the world? That is what makes the ark theory interesting. Maybe the people who built the silos understood that future generations would not willingly stay underground if they knew they were only backup copies of humanity. Imagine being born inside a concrete cylinder and being told, "You are here because someday, maybe, humanity might need you." Most people would not accept that. Eventually, someone would rebel. Someone would say, "Why should we sacrifice our lives for a future we may never see?" So the founders, or whoever came after them, created a stronger story. Not "you are waiting," not "you are backup," but outside is death, and the silo is all that exists. That lie would be cruel, but from the point of view of the people running the system, it might be considered necessary. And that is what makes Silo so disturbing. The villains in this story may not see themselves as villains. They may believe they are protecting the last fragile branch of humanity. They may believe every lie, every execution, every memory wipe, every shutdown, and every rebellion crushed is justified because the survival of the species is bigger than one life, or even one silo. But here's the problem. The ark theory still doesn't fully explain the safeguard, because if the silos are meant to preserve humanity, why create a system that can wipe out an entire silo? That is the detail that pushes the story from tragic into monstrous. A safeguard only makes sense if the people in charge believe some silos are expendable. Maybe if a population learns too much, rebels too hard, or risks contaminating the others with the truth, the system destroys it, not because the people inside are beyond saving, but because the idea spreading from that silo is dangerous. In other words, the real contamination may not be biological, it may be knowledge. And that brings us to the third theory, and this is the darkest one. The silos are an experiment. This is the theory that makes all the strange details start connecting. The surveillance, the fake history, the controlled information, the separation between silos, the cleaning ritual, the differences between communities, the hidden systems, the way every society underground seems to be managed like a pressure cooker. If the silos were only shelters, why hide the existence of other silos? If humanity is trying to survive together, why isolate each group so completely? Unless isolation is the point. Maybe each silo is not just the shelter, maybe each silo is a test environment, one version of society, one controlled sample, one closed system where people can be observed across generations. How do humans behave when they have no history? How do they respond to authority? How long does a lie last? What kind of myths form? What kind of rebellion appears? What type of leadership maintains order? What breaks a population? What keeps it obedient? That would make Silo much closer to Divergent than it first appears. In Divergent, people think their city is the whole world, only to discover they are part of a larger project being watched from outside. Silo may be playing with a similar nightmare. Not the exact same genetic idea, but the same emotional betrayal. People living their entire lives inside a fake reality, never knowing they're part of someone else's design. And this is where the subtle differences between silos matter. If one silo has a holiday, another does not, or one population has slightly different customs, rules, myths, or leadership structures, that may not be random. It may mean every silo was seeded with variations, different social programming, different stories, different pressure points. Maybe one silo is built to be more obedient, another more rebellious. And the horrifying question becomes, who is comparing the results? Because someone built a system where each group thinks it is alone, while the larger structure clearly suggests they are not. The existence of multiple silos already changes everything. A single bunker is survival. Dozens of bunkers are infrastructure. But dozens of isolated bunkers with controlled information, hidden protocols, and mass death failsafes start to look like a machine, not a shelter, a machine for managing human civilization. The counter-argument, of course, is cost. Building the silos would be unimaginably expensive. Trillions of dollars, insane engineering, huge political cooperation, and the level of secrecy that would be almost impossible in the modern world. Would anyone really spend that much money just to run a social experiment? Probably not, if it was only an experiment. But that is why the mixed theory is the strongest. The silos may have started as doomsday bunkers, then they became an ark, then the people in charge turned the ark into an experiment. That feels the most like silo, not one simple answer, but layers. A public explanation, a private purpose, and a hidden purpose underneath both. On the surface, the silos could have been presented as survival real estate, a luxury emergency plan for elites, politicians, scientists, and selected citizens. The public version may have been, the world is unstable, we are preparing safe communities. That would explain why people might have toured them like future residents or investors. It would not look like people fleeing the end of the world yet. It would look like people being sold the most important insurance policy in history. Then, when disaster either happened or was triggered, those shelters became humanity's backup plan. But once people were inside, the mission changed. The priority was no longer comfort, it was containment, control, continuity. The truth became dangerous because truth creates choice, and choice creates rebellion. So the people running the system did what powerful institutions always do in dystopian stories. They turned emergency power into permanent power. That is the real horror of silo, not just that people are trapped underground, but that the trap may have been justified at first. Maybe there really was a disaster. Maybe going outside really was dangerous. Maybe the first generation really needed strict rules to survive. But over centuries, the system stopped being about survival and started being about preserving itself. That is how a bunker becomes a prison. That is how an ark becomes a lab. That is how a civilization built to save humanity becomes something willing to kill humanity to protect the lie. And the biggest clue is the emotional design of the whole system. The silos do not only control bodies, they control memory. They control curiosity. They make people afraid of the past and terrified of the future. They turn the outside into a myth, the founders into gods, and the truth into a disease. That is why Juliet is so dangerous. Not because she is strong, even though she is. Not because she is smart, even though she is. Juliet is dangerous because she breaks the emotional logic of the system. She sees something false and refuses to politely live with it. She pulls at one thread, then another, until the whole story starts coming apart. And if Season 3 is really moving into the beginning of the world's collapse, then the show is no longer just asking whether Juliet can survive the silo. It's asking whether we can survive the truth about why the silo exists at all. Because if the silos were built after a disaster, that's scary. If they were built before the disaster, that's worse. But if they were built by people who knew the disaster was coming, profited from the panic, erased the past, and created systems to kill any community that learned too much, then Silo is not just a post-apocalyptic mystery. It's a story about the powerful designing the future before everyone else even knows the present is ending. So my best theory is this. The silos began as doomsday bunkers, were sold as survival, transformed into arks for humanity, then became experiments in control. Not because one person wanted to be evil, but because the system was built by people who believed order mattered more than freedom. And once that belief was coded into the walls, the screens, the suits, the tape, the laws, and the stories, every generation after that inherited a prison and called it home. And that is why the real reveal may not be that the outside is safe or unsafe. The real reveal may be that the people inside were never meant to know the difference. Because the silo doesn't just keep people underground. It keeps them from understanding why they were buried there in the first place.